r/Nosleep. Posted by you/thatonecityinchina. I put out a Craigslist ad for a new roommate to ward off my stalker and avoid violating my lease. My new roommate might be a demon. Part 5. Hey, guys, I'm back. So things have been incredibly busy and I haven't had much time to update from the last post. I actually debated updating you guys on what had happened to me recently. Just remembering everything is difficult enough, but sharing it is a whole other can of worms. The fact that I was an inch away from death really made it difficult for me to write down my latest experiences, but in the end, I thought that it'd better to get it out there in the open rather than have it fester from the inside. A lot's happened, and I want you guys to know. Some background before I get into things. It is currently every graduate student's dreaded nightmare, finals week. I was running on pure coffee and desperate desire to overachieve. If you're a student, this would probably sound all too familiar. And being that it was finals week, I had no time to humor Hector. Because he couldn't bother me as much as he used to, he had to turn to the next best thing, even more Netflix binge watching. Hector moved on from sitting through sitcoms to watching movies, particularly action films. He's been very invested into the Mission Impossible franchise, which explained his incessant desire to own a motorcycle and experience a motorcycle chase himself, even though I insisted that kind of thing never happened in real life. Of course, being that he is a demon with no other empirical obligations other than to pay rent and eat fried chicken, he invested in one. With the money he earned from the poleaxe, Hector acquired a motorcycle. How he managed to get one, I have no idea. I didn't ask how he was able to get his hands on a seemingly new motorcycle without having a proper license or training, and I certainly didn't ask how he managed to get a forged license plate for his bike. All I knew was, he came back home with a lot of scratches and blood for a few days after trying to learn how to ride his motorcycle. I never planned on going anywhere near the bike, but of course I was proven incorrect. "We've gotta go now," Hector said. He barged into my room as I searched for the mistake in my code, startling me. He was like a whirlwind going through my room in a frantic frenzy. He started throwing whatever clothes and shoes he could find lying around in my room into a duffel bag haphazardly. "Get ready, we're leaving in 10. "Whoa, dude, what are you doing? What's going on?" I saved my work quickly, knowing that ignoring him wouldn't work this time. Hector shut my laptop, tossing it in my duffel, and I got up from my seat. "That's my work." "Sorry, no time. I'll explain on the road. You're coming with me. Put on some clothes and meet me where I parked the motorcycle." Hector looked me straight in the eyes as he zipped up the duffel. He was already dressed in a leather jacket and ready to leave. "You know you can't just barge into my room and—" "I'm serious, we have to leave this place now." "Now, man." "Oh okay, just give me 5 minutes." I reluctantly agreed, nodding confusedly. Hector didn't respond. He took the duffel bag, rushed out of the apartment, and slammed the door. Hector was never frantic. He had two moods at all times, sarcastic and hungry. The fact that he was freaking out like this was alarming. I took his words at face value and just went along with whatever was going on with him. I pulled on a jacket, grabbed my phone, and locked the door to our apartment. I met Hector at his bike, where he tied our bags down in the back and handed me a helmet. I'd never ridden a motorcycle before, so I hoped Hector knew what he was doing. He revved up the engine and set off on his mission to get us as far away from our place as possible. The rush of being a motorcycle passenger was strange, and I was pretty sure I was one adrenaline drop away from freaking out completely. Weaving through city traffic was a hassle, but we eventually made it to the border between the city and the outskirts of town. The sun was beginning to set in, which casted a nice red hue on the city skyline as we whizzed by on the highway, leaving the urban hustle and bustle behind us. Even through the tinted motorcycle helmet, I could see the rays of sun peeking through the buildings. It would have been a great sight to behold if we weren't presumably running away from something. The thrill of being on a motorcycle wore off quickly, and I found myself hoping Hector was as good as he claimed he was. His lack of a license or certification worried me greatly. He seemed to be driving pretty well despite not having a proper license, but I hoped he remembered I was mortal and any motorcycle accident would hurt him temporarily and quite literally kill me. "So, what's the deal?" I shouted. The wind buffeting my ears made it difficult to hear anything. "What deal?" "Don't play dumb, you obviously didn't drag us out in such a rush to go on a peaceful road trip. What's going on with you?" I knew I was dragged into whatever Hector was going through, and I wanted answers. Hector sighed audibly and cut off a few cars in an effort to rush to wherever he was going. His increasingly reckless driving was making me extremely nervous and I hoped he had mastered riding his bike before taking me for a ride on it. Would you believe me if I said I wanted to act out a Tom Cruise car chase? No, I absolutely wouldn't. Alright, remember how I told you I was kicked out of hell? Hector yelled back. Well, it's finally coming back to bite me in the ass. Elaborate, please. I remembered he had mentioned that briefly during the interview, but it wasn't something I really pondered over in my daily life. In fact, Hector never really mentioned anything about his life in hell if I didn't ask, and I didn't ask much. Hector was silent as he zoomed through the traffic. I nonetheless prodded on. I wanted a proper response. Is everything okay? Look, I'm gonna be honest with you, everything is not okay. Shit's hit the fan. The authorities caught on to the fact that I ran away and they've managed to find my location. They've been on my ass since I left hell. They want to bring me back so I can go to the what you humans would call a court hearing. How did they find you? I don't know. But I've been on the run for a bit. Before I saw your Craigslist ad, I was all over the place. At one point I was walking through some desert in New Mexico cause I literally had nothing else to do but avoid them. Gorgeous place by the way, you should go sometime. Lots of sand, but if you're dehydrated enough you can hallucinate yourself a pool of water. Hector. I cut off his attempt to steer the conversation elsewhere. Right, sorry. Anyway, I wasn't being entirely honest with you when I said I was kicked out of hell because I refused to eat humans. It's part of the reason, but it wasn't the biggest reason. What was the biggest reason? It's complicated. Well, we have a long ride ahead of us, don't we? Plenty of time to explain. Nah, we just have to get far away from the city enough to throw them off my trail. Found a place far away enough from the city for us to stay at for a few days. I don't know who tipped them off, but they know where you live so the apartment's not safe for the time being. How do you know they're after you? My spidey senses were tingling. His sarcasm was insufferable. I reached around with my foot and kicked his shin. Ow. Fine, fine. I saw them wandering around the neighborhood looking for me at all the fried chicken joints I hit on the daily. They're really obvious to spot, cause they wear a super obvious clothing to show off the fact that they uphold the law or whatever. But they can't be seen by humans. Anyway, I was on my way to churches when I saw them. It's a good thing I saw them before they saw me, cause that's when I knew we had to leave. But what if they chase you down? If they manage to track you down to our neighborhood, they can probably track you to wherever we're going. They're not entirely omniscient, that's the thing. It's not like they have a tracker on me, all the information they get is entirely crowdsourced. I don't know how they tracked me to the city, but it's not like they have the ability to instantly show up wherever I am, and if it took them that long to locate the neighborhood, it's gonna take even longer if we're away from where they thought I was. I paused. Why don't you just go to your court hearing, man? You're really going through all this just to evade the law? I like avoiding my problems. Plus, it's what Tom Cruise would have done. Tom Cruise gets paid to pretend like he's being chased. He's not actually a fugitive like you are. And isn't running away just making everything worse for you? It seems like you're already in some pretty hot water with your authorities. I don't know how it works down there, but up here you get worse sentences for running away from your hearing. Not if you don't get caught. And I don't plan on getting caught. That's why we're running. Hector's idea of running was going to a remote area to hide out. And a few miles on the outskirts of the city was all he needed to feel safe. He found a quaint motel on his maps app and directed us there. When we arrived at the motel, the only source of light was from the full moon and the motel's flickering neon sign. It was small and looked a little run down, but it had a nice, rustic feel to it. The small motel faced the brilliant lake in front of it, and the moon's rays reflected off the choppy waves of the cold water. Hector tossed me my duffel, grabbed his own, and went inside. We checked into a room fairly quickly. Not many rooms were occupied despite the fact that it was a Friday night. The room was pretty standard: 2 beds, a TV, microwave, but what set the motel apart from others I had been to were the full-length windows that slid open and led into the lakefront. I set my duffel down on the bed and grabbed my laptop to settle into the desk by the window. I still had homework to complete. Hector may have been worried about going to hell prison, but I was worried about passing my classes and getting a decent score on my finals. Shit, I left the phone in the bike, Hector grumbled as he patted his jeans. I'm gonna go back out and grab it. Can you grab my water bottle while you're at it? I think I left it in there, too. Got it. Before leaving, Hector turned to me. By the way, don't leave this room, alright? The authorities won't be able to find us all the way out here, but like I said before, things from my world are hyper aware of your presence and we're out of your comfort zone. Creatures in your neighborhood know what's up, but creatures around here think you're fair game. Yeah, Yeah. I waved him off. Hector sauntered outside as I opened my laptop to find Wi-Fi so I could work on my coding project. Just because Hector was running away from demon cops, didn't mean I could sacrifice my GPA. Besides, it was nice being away from the city for a little bit, even if it wasn't exactly for vacation reasons. I cracked the window open a little. The breeze from the open window felt nice as I continued trying to find the mistake in my code that was keeping my program from running smoothly. A few moments later, I heard a splash. I looked out the window to see a child-sized figure emerging from the lake. It was puzzling to see a child alone so late at night without any parental supervision that I could see, so I leaned in closer and squinted. As if they sensed my gaze, the child turned around. The moon illuminated the water which reflected back on the child. It was a little boy, couldn't have been more than 10 years old from his appearance. And even though it was the middle of winter, he was only wearing swimming trunks and goggles as if he was about to go swimming in the freezing waters at 11 at night. He looked as if he was having fun in the cold waters like it was a warm summer evening. The child smiled back at me. He waved his hand as if to say, "Come play with me." I felt unsettled. Who was this kid and why was he by himself in the middle of the night on a cold winter lakefront? When it became clear I wasn't going to go outside, the child frowned and turned away from me. He looked back once more and fell backwards into the lake and disappeared completely in the blink of an eye. In a moment, his body resurfaced and I saw his limbs begin to thrash around in a panic. The next few seconds whizzed by. I jumped up from my seat out of pure instinct. I shoved Hector's warning to not go outside to the back of my head. I wasn't going to let a child drown because of his parents' negligence when I could do something about it. I had almost drowned as a kid, and it wasn't a fun experience. I slid the window open and ran outside to where the splashing was. The kid's limbs continued to thrash and I hoped to God I could make it on time. In hindsight, I should have known something was off. I really should have just ignored the fact that there was virtually no practical explanation for a young boy playing in a cold lake in the middle of winter. The moment I reached the lake, the thrashing immediately ceased and there was no sign of the boy. But as I approached the boundary between the water and dry ground, I realized something was very, very wrong. Instead of a boy, I saw various gray faces floating beneath the surface of the water. They were entirely disembodied, the faces weren't connected to a body, or even a neck that I could see. They were just heads. The faces' eyes were all closed, but the moment I was a step away from going into the water, the eyes shot open and they all focused at me. That's when I knew I had truly fucked up. Shit. Finn. I whipped my head around to Hector, fully prepared to dash back to safety. In a flash, I felt something slimy grip my ankle and wrist. The last thing I saw before I was pulled into the lake completely was Hector dashing towards me, looking perplexed. I should have listened to him. When I woke up, I was back in my room, my head throbbing. But I wasn't in my room back in the apartment, I was back in my childhood home. Had I been carried back to my parents' house? And how long had I been out? It was clearly nighttime, all the lights were out and all I could see from my window was darkness. The moon was the only source of illumination, with the bare branches of trees creating airy shadows in my room. The alarm clock next to my bed read 1 a.m. This was weird. How had I ended up back here? My twin-sized childhood bed suddenly felt restrictive and I wriggled myself out of my sheets. I felt my way through my room to find the light and turned it on. To my surprise, everything looked somewhat normal, just the way I left it when I moved out. My closet was pretty much empty, and my old superhero posters were still hanging onto my fading walls. The ceiling was still plastered with glow-in-the-dark stars that I got for my 10th birthday. The normalcy of everything threw me off. Hadn't I just been pulled into a lake on the outskirts of the city? Feeling more than a little unsettled, I tiptoed out of my room. The hallway was dark and my parents' room was closed. The tap from the sink in the bathroom dripped steadily, as if someone forgot to turn off the faucet completely. I looked down the stairs, reluctant to move around in such a creepy atmosphere. "Hector?" I called nervously. No response. I gulped and tried again, speaking up a little louder from the top of the stairs. Maybe he wasn't here, but hopefully my parents were. "Mom? Dad?" As soon as the words left my mouth, the light in the kitchen turned on. I breathed a sigh of relief. My parents always did have a habit of staying up late and snacking as they watched TV, sometimes they'd stay up until 3 on weekends watching old movies. A faint blue glow came from the living room along with some canned laughter, indicating my parents were watching something. "Are you up, Finn? We're down here, honey, come join us." My mother's familiar voice put me at ease, and I made my way down the stairs. As I walked down, I noticed that the pictures in the stairway were altered in a strange way. They were lined with our usual family photos, but in every single one, I was crossed out vigorously with black Sharpie. In the last photo leading to the living room, I was ripped out of the photo entirely. This made me incredibly anxious. What on earth was going on? I gingerly approached the living room to find my parents sitting and facing away from me, fixated on the television. I was immediately appalled by the contents of the show they were watching. It seemed to be a black and white movie, complete with a grainy screen and muffled audio. The TV was on a strange loop, constantly repeating a scene in which a man was getting decapitated on a guillotine, blood gushing everywhere, with canned laughter running in the background at the most inappropriate times. At times, the TV would fizz out into a woman calling out for help, only to revert back to the guillotine again. What the hell are you guys watching? This wasn't right. My parents were the types to watch vintage films, Hallmark Christmas movies and rom-coms, not gory horror movies. In fact, my father was hemophobic and the very mention of blood was often enough to make him feel sick inside. He could not have been watching this without an upset stomach. My mother slowly turned to me, but something about her was off. Her closed smile was too wide, too plastic to be my mom. Her eyes looked as if they had trouble focusing and had a milky, yellowish hue to them. Her movements were too stiff and rigid, almost as if she was being controlled remotely like a toy. My father's head turned to me slowly as well, and he grinned as he locked eyes with me, revealing a set of sharp, pointy, yellow teeth that I could only describe as anglerfish-like. "Welcome home, son." I screamed and backed off. My parents remained glued to the couch, both sporting the same creepy smile. Their faces and bodies began to melt, leaving only saggy, wrinkled skin with those ugly teeth and dead fish-like eyes. They cackled, and I realized they didn't even sound like my parents anymore. The living room was melting along with them, the wallpaper was peeling from the walls and what was left of my melted parents was quickly becoming one with the melting couch. I made my way to the kitchen to try and get away from this insanity, but in my frenzied attempt to run away I tripped and fell on my ass ungraciously. As I scanned the room for what I had tripped over, I saw a familiar face, the woman with the twisted limbs from the subway incident. This time, she was missing the bottom half of her body, her intestines were falling out behind her. She was crawling towards me at an ungodly speed, reaching out with her trampled fingers to grab at my ankles to keep me from escaping. I didn't know how the hell she had ended up in my house, but I wasn't having it. I scrambled away from the kitchen and scanned the house for my two options: either I could run back upstairs or I could lock myself in the basement. I remembered the creepy photos on the staircase and opted out of the former, not wanting to see those strange photos again. I quickly dashed to the basement, yanked open the door, and slammed it shut behind me. I breathed heavily, but that wasn't even the end of it. As soon as I was able to catch my breath, a frantic series of knocks came from behind the door. I grabbed at the handle to keep anyone from the outside from opening it. "Finn? Why won't you open the door?" Amy's titillating, psychotic voice wafted through the doorway. When I didn't respond, she began banging the door, jiggling the handle, and repeating the same inquiry over and over again. I put my hands over my ears to drown out her voice, the sound of my heartbeat overpowering her crazed threats. She was wailing at this point, slamming the door with her fists from the other side and crying about how she just wanted to marry me and how I was making her so miserable by rejecting her. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the door back, demanding for her to shut up. Her wails ceased at once, and I was left with an uncomfortable silence. After so much noise, the silence was deafening. I let go of the handle, hoping she wasn't there anymore to open the door. I needed to find a way out of this madness. The basement was dark, so I turned on the emergency red lights, hoping I could find a hole or window to crawl out of. I regretted it instantly. The basement was otherwise empty except for a lone figure standing by herself with a table and butcher knife in front of her, chopping away at animal parts with a satisfied smile on her face. It was Naomi, wearing an apron and surgical gloves. She grinned, revealing the same set of anglerfish-like teeth that I saw in my parents. "So nice of you to join us, Finn," she said, blood spattering her clothes and her face. "It's always so lonely down here in the basement." Naomi revealed what she was working on: a grotesque abomination of a taxidermized cat, made from different cat body parts. It had the head of a tabby and the body of a calico, mismatched legs of different sizes, and a tail that clearly didn't belong. The taxidermy stared me down with dead yellow eyes. Naomi made no motion to move towards me, but I screamed anyway and ran back up to the top of the stairs. She continued to chop, and her figure was beginning to melt just like my parents did in the living room. I heard the wails of cats echo throughout the room and her crazed giggles as she melted away. As soon as she melted into a puddle, something bubbled from what was left of Naomi. The bubbling became louder and more insistent, and a hole burst forth with water. I held my breath. The steady trickle of water began to multiply in other areas of the floor of the basement, and I found myself inching further and further away as the water pooled to cover the entire surface area of the floor. The basement was flooding with water. I looked side to side for any escape, but to no avail. I even tried opening the basement door despite knowing what was on the other side, but it wouldn't budge. For some odd reason, the basement door was locked completely and there were no windows I could climb out of. I was effectively trapped. Even if I waited at the top of the stairs, I knew that it was only a matter of time before the water reached me. And if I broke open the door, there was no telling that whatever was on the other side of the door was any less terrifying than death by drowning. I had nowhere to run. I mentioned I had no idea of what would happen to me in the last installment, and it was because I was never prepared to be thrust into a situation where I would have to come face to face with my darkest fears. I never felt as close to death as I did in that very moment. I could feel all hope beginning to leave my body. I realized whatever I was going through was my worst nightmares, and all my fears were manifesting themselves in an acid trip-like hallucination. There was nowhere for me to go to escape this hellish nightmare. I just wished I had thought before I acted upon a clearly nonsensical situation. There was no logical explanation for a little kid to be swimming in the lake in the middle of winter. I should have known it was an otherworldly trap. I should have listened to Hector. My carelessness was truly catching up with me, and this time I'd die for it. I crawled into a fetal position at the top of the stairs with my back facing the door, trying to come to terms with my impending death. I'd heard drowning wasn't so bad. I heard it was quick, mostly painless, just cold and empty and incredibly lonely. I hoped that was true, because that was ultimately what was awaiting me. The water was rising at an ungodly speed. I shut my eyes, preparing for the worst. In an instant, the basement door opened and I tumbled backwards. I scrambled up desperately, wondering when Amy had come back to open the door, but to my relief all I saw was Hector as he had been when he was fake exorcising Mabel, in all his half-demon glory. Hector. I was extremely glad to see him for once. While his half-demon form normally put an uneasy feeling in my chest, it was more than a welcoming presence in the moment. "Dude, we can't stay here. You have to wake up." I paused in my hysterics. "What are you talking about? Do you have any idea how to get out of here?" Hector glanced at me for a moment, then at the door, and then at the basement water quickly rising to the top of the stairs. It was only a matter of seconds before we'd be caught by the water. "You're gonna hate me." Hector sighed. "But you're not gonna wake up if I don't do this." "What?" Hector's gnarled hands shot forward and pushed me. "Sorry in advance." Hector shoved me down the stairs directly into the water. I felt myself hit the water head first and immediately submerge inside the freezing temperatures. In a panic I screamed, and water went up my nose. Why the fuck did Hector shove me into the very water I was trying to avoid? All around me was murky darkness, and there was no indication that I was even in the basement anymore. It felt like I was floating in the murky lake of the motel. As my consciousness began to fade, Hector quickly jumped in after me and grabbed me by my leg. He then proceeded to quickly twist my ankle. In a split second, my eyes shot open and the hallucinations that I'd been having dissipated in front of me. I was still submerged in water, but this time I knew exactly where I was, near the surface of the water at the lake, surrounded by gray faces and moss. I was face to face with whatever dragged me in. I cried out in severe pain and snapped back into reality, swallowing a bunch of water in the process, and the only reason I didn't drown in a panic was because Hector was by my side, pulling me away from the creature and snapping me back to reality. My throat burned from the water and I tried to make an effort to refrain from swallowing any more. Now I could see the creature in all its monstrosity. A brief glimpse was all it took for me to shudder. It was hard to make out uber-specific details given that the water was murky and I was busy focusing on not drowning, but I saw all I needed to see. The creature looked like an old, wizened crone, with grayish-blue skin wrinkled from being underwater for so long. Its switch-like, crooked nose was covered in warts and its yellow, baggy eyes stared helplessly as it shrunk away into the depths of the water. It was covered in moss, seaweed, and other lake debris which made the rest of its features difficult to see, but it opened its mouth and I saw anglerfish-like teeth jutting out from its face, much like the teeth I saw in my hallucinations of my parents. From its bony body sprouted thin, tendril-like limbs that stretched out and connected to the faces concealed by the moss. The many frozen faces within its body stared back at me, expressions now peaceful instead of being contorted in pain and shock. As Hector swam us away from the monster, I saw the face of the little boy that had initially lured me in, staring at me with those dead eyes behind his swimming goggles. "You're really fucking annoying, you know that?" Hector grumbled. He carried me back to the room on his back, both of us soaking wet from the lake. I was still coughing up water, and Hector made a sound of annoyance. Did I or did I not warn you to not leave the goddamned room? I left for less than a minute and you got yourself into a huge mess. How many times do I have to warn you about shit before you actually listen to me? I'm sorry, okay? You're right, I should have listened to you. I sighed, regretting my stupid decision to jump outside to save what I thought was a little kid despite Hector's clear warnings. But couldn't you just, I don't know, punch me or something to snap me out of it instead of twisting my fucking ankle? My ankle throbbed in pain despite the coldness settling into my bones. I was definitely going to have to stay off my ankle for a while, maybe even see a doctor for it. Those things are nasty. And this one in particular had a pretty good grip on you. That's how it gets you. It lures you in with something it knows will drag you to its lair, traps you in your thoughts, and fucks you up by exposing you to your darkest fears by probing into your subconscious. I tried slapping you awake in the water, but you didn't budge. You're lucky all it took to snap you out of it was twisting your ankle. Hector replied. I gulped, not wanting to think about what would have happened to me had Hector not intervened. I most likely would have ended up like those faces in the lake, trapped in unending fear forever. Well, thanks for always saving my ass, I said as Hector kicked open the door to our room. I shivered from the cold, trying not to sound bitter, but having your life endangered does that to a person. They're always looking for another soul to have. They're lonely and want company, but they end up killing humans in the process. They're harmless on their own and can't physically hurt you, but they trap you in your thoughts, so you drown in real time and can't ever escape. You'd be stuck in that nightmarish hell forever. Hector let me down gently onto the bed, making sure to avoid grazing my ankle. He grabbed a big towel from the bathroom and tossed it to me, and quickly arranged the pillows to elevate my ankle. I dried myself off as Hector rummaged through my duffel and handed me some clothes to change into. So the monster was bringing out my fears to trap me in the water? And I would have been trapped there forever? Yep. Everything you saw was a product of your own subconscious. Amy, Naomi, drowning, your parents melting into creepy human puddles. The deeper you fall into your fears, the easier it is for the monster to keep you in. All those faces you saw connected to its limbs were people who fell victim to its games. And unfortunately, their souls will never make it out of there until the monster decides it wants to let them go. You're lucky you didn't drown, you actually weren't in the water for more than a few seconds. I coughed up more water, and Hector slapped my back a few times to help me through my coughing fit. I went through a lot more than a few seconds. Yeah, but it's not like That was pretty fucking scary, I blurted. Being face to face with your fears like that? And to think, if you weren't there, I would have been stuck in that shit forever. That's not right. I could have died. You wouldn't understand 'cause you're immortal, but I only have one chance at life. Hector exhaled. I mean, you do have a point. I was a little surprised at how well you've been taking this whole thing, considering you went from not believing in this kind of thing to being thrown into it. The human subconscious is a weird thing. It makes me think, I muttered. If I would have ever went through stuff like this if you weren't here. Hector went silent at that. I immediately regretted the way that sounded. It sounded like I was blaming him when it wasn't entirely his fault that weird stuff was happening to me. It also sounded ungrateful, after he went out of his way to rescue me. But being that I just survived a near-death experience, I paid little attention to filtering my words. Sorry. I don't blame you, he finally said, turning away. I'm gonna shower first. Lake water is so bad for the skin. Hector's original plans were for us to stay at the motel for the entire weekend, just to be safe. But being that my ankle needed immediate medical attention and that I needed to attend my classes for final exams, he reluctantly agreed to bring us back the morning after the debacle. The motorcycle ride back was difficult with a twisted ankle, but luckily the motel had some immediate first aid so we could wrap my ankle in a makeshift cast until I got to a bigger hospital. I emailed my professors about the near-death experience, omitting the nightmarish details, of course, and my twisted ankle, and they were willing to give me an extension for projects and exams. I thanked my lucky stars for that, at least. I have to admit, as much as Hector's presence did put me in danger, I also felt a sense of relief from his presence. It was weird. His very being was putting me into these whack situations, but I still felt safer with him around. I couldn't really explain it. With Hector being such a prominent figure in my life, I guess I fell into a habit of complacency and casual banter whenever he was around. I knew I had to apologize to him for somewhat blaming him for everything that had happened, but it felt to me like one of those awkward things that you don't really bring up again. The ride back was awkward and silent enough, and after a couple of days things went back to normal, so I didn't mention it and neither did he. It never occurred to me that one day, Hector would have to leave. I truly didn't realize the end was nearing before we knew it, but I wish I had.